So today, this right now, we're pleased to bring to you Brent Piniuta. Sorry, Brent. Anyways, Brent's based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he's a researcher with the National Museum of the Royal Navy. He's been working with artifacts and background around the HMS Invincible. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brent, I believe you actually had the opportunity to dive on the wreck, which would be incredible too. So anyways, maybe I got that wrong. Brent will correct me, but in any event, let's turn it over to Brent and away we go.
All right, thanks, Tom. And you did get it right. I dived on the Invincible wreck in 2016, which I will go into detail a little later. So welcome, everyone. My name is Brent, of course. I'm joining you from Winnipeg, Manitoba. And for our guests abroad, of course, I'm in Canada. And by day, I'm a project manager with the City of Winnipeg. And in my free time, recently, I've been a volunteer historical researcher with the National Museum of the Royal Navy and working on the Diving Deep HMS Invincible 1744 museum exhibition. So without further delay, let's get started on my presentation, the sinking of the Invincible. Now, the Invincible was a British warship in the mid-18th century. So just for some background and context to this story, here's a map of European trade routes in and around the time frame of 1750. And as you can see, trade and commerce were bustling in the world, and there were a number of established trade routes crisscrossing the oceans. And if you could say in general, the key players at this time were England, France, and Spain. So at this time, the world was also embroiled in political turmoil, and there were a number of theaters of war around the corners of the globe. And this is known today as the 7 Years' War. That this occurred between 1756 and 1763. I'm not a historian, but I think the key belligerents were England, France, Spain, and Russia. So by many historians, this is considered the first true World War. And this is just because of the multiple theaters of war across spanning the globe. And in Europe, South America, and West Africa, conflicts were associated with sovereignty and territorial claims. In India, conflicts were associated with trade expansion in the territories. And in the Caribbean, on this side of the globe, there were skirmishes over the cane sugar trade. And here in North America, the 7 Years' War is sometimes referred to as the French and Indian War. And the conflicts were associated with land claims, territorial control, resources, and emerging economies. So at this time in history, if your country was a world superpower, you gained that control with your military might and having a very strong military. And part of this would be very strong naval forces. And navies of the day built these impressive wooden ships of the line, as they were called. And they were used for a number of different reasons, of course. They could be used to land troops on enemy soil. They could be used to protect trade convoys, and they could also, of course, used for engagements at sea with rival enemies. All right, so let's just look at a cross-section of one of those ships of the day. This is what's called a first-rate ship of the line, also termed sometimes man of war. And as you can see, these ships were nothing more than gun platforms to mount gun batteries of multiple cannon. And in below here, you had the hold of the ship and the orlop deck, the lowest deck. And this was used really for the storage and equipment for provisions and months at sea. So here we see a typical gun deck on a ship of the day. This is actually a picture I took on board HMS Victory. The Victory was built in 1765, and of course it's known for fighting at the Battle of Trafalgar with Lord Nelson. So these battles were crude and horrible things. The cannons were very lethal and yet very simplistic. They belched out tons of acrid smoke that choked out the crews. And of course, when enemy shots came in, they hit the wood, splinter everywhere, and generally cause great carnage. And the blood would literally flow down these decks. And yet, despite this, sailors in the Royal Navy often welcomed the opportunity to go into battle. And this is because at this time in history, the Royal Navy had a very unique incentive program. And this was if a cruise ship could capture an enemy ship, as you see depicted here, they took that ship back to their home port. The Royal Navy would assess the ship and buy it from the captor crew. And so you can see here that sailors stood to gain financially, even if they were risking their life in the process. And I think you could argue that this helped the Royal Navy gain naval supremacy in the 18th and early 19th centuries. All right, so the story of the Invincible itself begins in 1741 in a place called Rochefort, France. Now, Rochefort is on the west coast of France, as you can see here. It's on the Charente River estuary. And at this time, Rochefort was a very important naval dockyard for the French Navy. And so ships would be built here, they would be repaired here, and they'd be provisioned and staged for outgoing fleets. So it was a critical hub location for the French Navy. So the keel of the Invincible was laid down in 1741, and the ship was completed in 1744. This here is a general depiction of a ship being built in and around that time. So this obviously predates the Industrial Revolution, and these ships were built by sheer muscle power. No machines, no steam equipment that followed in the next century. So these were massive industrious undertakings to build one of these ships. The Invincible itself was a 2-gun deck ship, 74 guns, 3-masted, and it was called a square-rigged ship. So after the Invincible was launched in 1744, I went on to join service in the French Navy immediately. And 3 years later, in May of 1747, the Invincible was on an expedition to India at the time with other French Navy ships, and they were encountered by a British naval fleet. And this occurred off the coast of Spain at a place called Cape Finisterre. So here we see a period artist depiction of the Battle of Cape Finisterre. In the center here, you see the British flagship, and just off to the right in the foreground actually is a depiction of the Invincible. So the British had taken note of the Invincible prior to the battle and recognized the ship as a very new, large, and powerful warship. And they were keen to capture the Invincible as a war prize. So a very heated battle took place, and after the Invincible expended all of her ordnance, the ship surrendered and was taken by the captor crews. And the ship was among other French ships that were taken at the battle. They were escorted back to Portsmouth Dockyard, which was a key naval base for the Royal Navy in England. Now here you see another period artist depiction, and this is shortly after the battle, probably several months. The Invincible here and two other French ships that were captured at the battle are being fitted out for service in the Royal Navy. So what had happened at the time is the Admiralty had highly regarded the Invincible, and they paid the captor crew a price of £24,000 sterling, which today's money is millions of dollars. And this just goes to show how highly regarded the Invincible was at the time and how highly sought after it was. And of course, obviously, a devastating blow to the Royal Navy to lose, the French Royal Navy to lose such a brand new and powerful warship. So we're lucky today to know what the Invincible did look like back in the day due to some period artwork and illustrations. This is an engraving by Robert Short. It was published in 1751. And it is said to be an exact illustration of His Majesty's ship, the Invincible. And you can see here at the time, it was very popular, maybe more so in the previous century, to adorn their warships with ornate carvings in the stern galleries and also in the bow with their figureheads and whatnot. So while the Invincible was performed a very utilitarian function, it was also, I would argue, a beautiful warship at the same time. So here we have another illustration of the Invincible back in the day. This was actually a sketch done by a captain's clerk who had served on the Invincible in and around the same time. And it was actually found in his journal on the backside of a letter he had written. And you can actually see in the background here on the reverse side, just some ghosting of his writing. So anyway, it's very fascinating for me and others to see such an impressive illustration, which really depicts, I think with great accuracy, how the Invincible looked. And at this time was said to be at Portsmouth Dockyard. All right, so after capture in 1747, the ship was repaired and it was refitted to English specifications, and it was brought into service in the Royal Navy. And so the ship performed a number of duties. This included guard ship status at Portsmouth Harbor. It also offered convoy protection for some of their merchant trade vessels, and also at times performed blockade duty, where Britain antagonized their enemies outside their major naval ports and coastal cities. And so the ship was really ahead of her time as far as the British were concerned. It was a very large ship. It mounted a very powerful battery of guns. And at the same time, it was very fast, about 2 to 3 knots faster than comparable English ships of the line at the time. And as you can see in the last quote here, just considered the best ship overall of her class by the Admiralty. So once again, very highly regarded in the Royal Navy. All right, I'd like to jump ahead to the year 1757 and what is called the Siege of Louisbourg. Okay, we have to go back to the background of the 7 Years' War here in North America. And as you can see, France held a absolutely massive territory in North America, which we call New France today. And there were 2 very strategic cities for France in the new colony here, and that was Quebec in the top right corner here, founded 1608. And also cities in the Gulf of Mexico area, New Orleans and Baton Rouge, founded 1718, 1719. And their significance was really associated with the fact that the colonies were serviced from France by ships, carrying troops, civilians, materials back and forth. And so arguably, Quebec City was probably the most important to France because of its close proximity, closest to the homeland country of France. And the cities on the Gulf of Mexico were at a bit of disadvantage because ships had to travel that extra distance down the seaboard and then enter the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, here in North America, in the late summer and fall, this area is notorious for hurricanes. And so there was that extra difficulties associated with shipping during those times. So again, just to highlight that Quebec was the most important city, I would say, at the time. And sandwiched in between New France were colonies of Britain. And this included Rupert's Land to the north. Rupert's Land was associated with the beginning of the fur trade about a century before. And of course, we have the early settlements on the eastern seaboard here, from the Carolinas all the way up to a territory holding in Nova Scotia. And in the background, of course, there were competing interests for the territories, including Spain, this large chunk here. And they held present-day Mexico, parts of Texas, Arizona, Colorado, and California. They also held Florida and parts of the Caribbean. And there was also unorganized territories in the Northwest that hadn't fallen to any territorial domination. So really a highlight of the 7 Years' War at this time was the fact that the territories associated with North America were kind of prime real estate because you had this almost unlimited new supply of natural resources like timber for ships and whatnot. But you also had emerging trade and commerce. So everyone wanted a piece of this pie for political power. And at this time, Britain was very keen to, if you will, pardon my expression, kick France out of the colony here and try and claim complete domination and close this gap here between the North and the East territories. All right, so if we zoom in to the eastern seaboard of Canada and Northeast United States today, you see here Quebec almost in the center. Quebec City is on the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River empties out into the St. Lawrence Seaway, which becomes the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and this empties out into the Atlantic Ocean. So here you can see very well the illustration of the French route servicing their new colony, going into the Gulf of St. Lawrence to approach Quebec City. And this was really the hub of New France at the time. So in their aspirations to dominate and engage the French in war and try and turf them out of the continent, the British really foresaw that they would have to take Quebec City to make that first step for their imperial domination. However, at this time, the French had built a very formidable military stronghold here at Louisbourg, which is in a very strategic location, kind of at the gateway to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So, the French staged military troops on land here, and they also had a large harbor at Louisbourg to stage their warships. And their warships would patrol these waters and protect both their military and civilian interests in servicing the colony. So the British recognized that if they had any chance at taking Quebec City, the first thing they would have to do actually is take control of Fortress Louisbourg. So today, Fortress Louisbourg survives. It was reconstructed and restored by the Canadian government and is a national historic site. I've never been, but I understand it's a very impressive historical fortification. So if you get the chance to visit it, I heard it's definitely worth a visit. All right, so getting back to 1757, so the British government enacted their plans, and in the beginning of the year, they sent a war fleet over the Atlantic, and they landed at Halifax. So I have here a period illustration of Halifax Harbor as it would have been seen in the mid-18th century. So here you can see obviously the British anchorage for their war fleet and the city or the town of Halifax in the background. So the British ships, upon arrival in June, they spent the next few months readying for the planned siege at Louisbourg. So this involved getting their ships ready. They assembled troops that were coming from both across the seas and elsewhere in North America. So collecting them together on their transport ships and just provisioning those troops and the crews on board the ships as well. So in early fall, the fleet at Halifax left the harbor. They traveled up the coast, and they got to relatively close to Louisbourg, right around here. And this is where two things happened. So the first thing that happened is they sent scout ships up to Louisbourg just to perform some reconnaissance and have a look, see at what was going on. And those scout ships observed a very strong military presence at the time, both land troops and ships of war of the French Navy anchored there. And in actuality, the fleet was much stronger than the logistical information had provided to the Navy, the Royal Navy at the time. The second thing that happened is as they were approaching Louisbourg, again, this was fall, the fleet encountered a horrific hurricane. Now, let me just say that the coast of Nova Scotia here is very unforgiving. It's very rocky, and this would put ships in peril at the best of times. So when this hurricane blew up, it really had a major impact on the fleet. At least one ship was lost on the rocks, and a number of other ships, including the Invincible, were badly damaged by wind and sea in the hurricane. So what happened is the War Council convened after the hurricane. They evaluated their circumstances of the strong French presence at Louisbourg and the compromised integrity of their forces, and they made a decision to call off the planned siege. And so what happened is the English fleet turned tail. They limped back across the Atlantic to Portsmouth, England, where the ships would be repaired and reprovisioned. All right, so that war fleet returned to England in November of 1757. And by that time, the British government was already planning to send the fleet back and having another go at Louisbourg in the following year. And they were criticized in 1757 for leaving England too late and putting them in peril in the hurricane season on the eastern seaboard of North America. So the plan for 1758 was to leave earlier and get there earlier and fight earlier and avoid the possibility of hurricanes. By February 1758, the fleet had been repaired, including the Invincible, which had been badly damaged. It was actually, in fact, almost sank off the coast of Nova Scotia. Nonetheless, got back to England. The entire fleet was repaired. The crews were freshened. New troops were put aboard. So there were military troops, ground troops being transported to the fleet, to North America by the fleet. And of course, then the ships and the crews were reprovisioned. So this was ready by the 19th of February, 1758. So what happened early in the morning on the 19th of February is the fleet admiral, Edward Boscawen, gave the order to the fleet to weigh anchor. And just for context here, this is the south coast of England, as you can see here in the box. And Portsmouth is on Portsea Island, and the naval base, Portsmouth Dockyard, is at this inlet here. And the Navy of the day had an anchorage in the water here known as the Solent. And this, I guess you could call it maybe an inlet of the English Channel. Anyway, this area was known as an anchorage called Spithead. And so war fleets would be staged in and around this area. So, as I said, the order to weigh anchor was given early morning on the 19th of February. So the Invincible with the rest of the fleet complied. And this is where things kind of went south for the crew of the Invincible. So the first problem to occur was the anchor actually got stuck on the seabed, and the crews had to haul on the capstan bars, trying to pull that cable up. It took that a couple hours out of the early morning to undertake that. And when the anchor finally did let go, it actually got jammed up. It popped up and got jammed on the underwater portion of the ship's hull and got stuck there. So this was obviously less than ideal, but by this time, the rest of the fleet had already departed, making their way out to the channel, and the Invincible had to catch up. So the crew, so I should say the captain, the master, gave the orders to set sail, and they began a sailing procedure called attack. And this attack is really just zigzagging across the wind to gain headway, and they could make their way out into the English Channel. Now, if that weren't bad enough circumstances with the anchor and whatnot, as they undertook the first tack maneuver, the ship's rudder jammed. And so now the ship was actually out of control. And the final nail in the coffin for the Invincible was that it was heading straight for a shallow, which is called the Horsetail. It's a sandbank just off the coast. And with the ship being out of control, the helm, had no ability to correct course. And so the Invincible went straight up and grounded on the Horsetail sandbank. So this was not an immediate problem. This was relatively common back in the day for this to happen. And the process was for crews to lighten a ship and hopefully get it off under high tides conditions. And so they would take off all the heaviest parts of the ship, like the things on board, such as cannon and casks and whatnot, trying to lighten the ship. So that work was undertaken immediately. Unfortunately, what happened is over the next 3 days, the weather worsened. And on the third day, a strong gale blew up, and it actually pushed the ship over on her port side, a term called going on her beam ends. And at this point, it was really the day of reckoning, as the ship was now considered to be lost. And so the ship's crew abandoned the vessel, and they were taken off in boats. And in coming days, turning into weeks and months, attendees from the dockyard went out trying to dismantle as much of the ship as they possibly could because there was no hope of salvaging it. And they would also take off what stores and equipment that they could. Unfortunately, within a few days of wrecking, the hold, or the lowest portion of the ship, had flooded, as well as the two lowermost decks. And so while some things could be taken off the ship, everything that was beneath in the hold basically was lost on the wreck. And, years turned into decades, and eventually the wreck disappeared under the waves and was lost to sand and sea, and of course to time. It's just worthy to go back to talk about what happened with the rest of the fleet. They did go on, they crossed the Atlantic, and the siege of Louisbourg occurred between June 8th and July 26th of 1758. Now, this involved a British force of 150 transport ships, some 40 men of war, or warships. And it was in this action that General Amherst landed troops, and the troops went on to capture Fortress Louisbourg. And of course, this paved the way for the Battle of Quebec in the following year. The Battle of Quebec City occurred in September 1759. And this is where General Wolfe stormed the Plains of Abraham and captured Quebec City. Now, following this, the French seceded most of its possessions in eastern North America, and Britain had established their dominance of the continent at least until the War of Independence. So at this point, I just wanted to take a break and open up the floor to any questions.
Thanks, Brent. We've got a couple quick ones to start. The original name of the ship, the Invincible, was it obviously it was built by the French Navy. What was it named then? Did the British change the name, or was it?
Right. It's an excellent question, and I failed to tell everybody that at the start. The ship was named L'Invincible by the French Navy. So what the English did is they retained the name and just became the English connotation, Invincible. And I think this was probably done rather intentionally at the time because it would have been a sore spot for the French Navy to see their former warship under British colors, but carry the same name. So I think there was probably some political posturing there, but great question.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And then David Markham was asking about, I think he was referring to when the Invincible was heading towards that sandbar. I believe it was the horse's tail, you called it.
Yes.
Was there no other way without a rudder to stop the ship or steer it? I mean, could the sails have been used to maneuver at all, or was it somewhat hopeless?
Yeah, so another great question. Obviously, the loss of the rudder, they could not steer. However, they could still use the sails to manage the ship. Unfortunately, that they didn't have the luxury of time, and you can imagine with just on sheer muscle power and the number of crew involved, take time to reset all the yards that held the sails in place. And so they did begin a maneuver like that immediately. And unfortunately, it just wasn't in time to regain some control of the ship. And so it was, of course, lost.
Great, thank you. And then just one more personally, and then I'll remind everybody that if there are other questions that I don't get to now, we'll try to catch them on the next break. Was there were there any consequences for the loss of the ship? Was the captain court-martialed after that?
Yeah. Another excellent question. Yeah, so it was standard practice as it is today that the captain be court-martialed for the loss. And that court-martial took place shortly thereafter the wrecking in early March. And basically, site conditions in the Solent were left to blame for the circumstances of the loss of the ship. Essentially, that the sand had grown and accumulated on the horsetail more than any of the pilots in the Navy of the day could have envisioned or anticipated. And so it was for that the captain and the officers were acquitted, basically being left blameless. It was just a question of circumstances that were unfortunate that led to the loss.
Fantastic, thank you. And as I say, we'll get to some more questions in a few minutes. Thank you.
All right, great questions, everyone. Thank you. All right, so moving on, I'd like to fast forward, more than 2 centuries to the year 1979, and this was the chance discovery, or maybe you call it rediscovery, of the wreck of the Invincible. So one day, a local Portsmouth fisherman named Arthur Mack was out with a friend in the friend's small fishing boat. They had their trawl net set out behind, and as they motored along, the nets snagged some type of underwater obstruction some 30 feet below, and bringing their fishing boat to an abrupt stop. So after some grief, they were able to rip the nets free, and as they were bringing their nets back up onto the boat, in the nets, they found some large chunks of some old oak timbers. And these timbers were fastened together with some wooden pegs, which are called trunnels. And Arthur, his whole life had been interested in history. And at that time, he was aware that these timbers were probably associated with the wreck of an old wooden ship. And so he actually became obsessed over this, about what he'd found. And just to say, in years prior, Arthur, who was characterized as an extremely lucky man, in his fishing career had found other artifacts in the Solent through his fishing and on land as well. Found other things in the sea of value, like artifacts from old ships of the time. And so he really believed that what he'd found, these timbers, they belonged to an old ship of some sort. And I think he probably had visions of treasure in his eyes. So for that reason, he went back in the weeks following, trying to relocate the wreck in between his fishing activities. And so later in the month, he did relocate the wreck and took notes by taking transits with land features, the coast being some 3 miles northward in north of the Solent. So one day he was back in Portsmouth Harbor, and he ran into a friend of his named John Broomhead. And at the time, John was a sport diver, a recreation diver. And so Arthur got the idea to ask John if he would go out with him. And he'd asked John if he'd dive on the wreck or dive on whatever they had found, just to try and figure out what Arthur had found. So that did occur. And when they went out in their very first dive, they encountered some jagged timbers protruding from the seabed along a distance of some 200 feet. And originally, they believed this was probably an old pier or a jetty that had been collapsed and washed out to sea and sank at some point in time. But at the same time, they also found some other interesting objects on the seabed, almost in plain sight. And these, upon investigation, turned out to be quite old objects, artifacts as they were, maybe up to some 300 years old. So here is an article, period news article from the day. You can see Arthur on the left here with John Broomhead. And Arthur is holding this large wheel-looking thing. It's actually a truck from a gun carriage. And this thing in the center here is a pulley belonging to, ship's rigging. And quite an interesting item here is this grenade. And then to the right here, you see an hourglass or a sand glass used for measuring time. And the last item here, more recognizable as a wooden spade. So obviously, they were very fascinated by the artifacts they were finding, and they were finding so much that it actually just became a bit too much for them to manage. And so they looked for some professional help, recognizing that they would be probably undertaking an archaeological program. So they approached the Royal Navy at Portsmouth, and they were given reference a fellow named John Bingaman, who was a commander at the time in the Royal Navy. And John Bingaman had experience with underwater archaeology and wreck diving. And so he actually was fascinated by the find and agreed after going out and diving on the wreck to join forces with Arthur and John as the first project team. So fellow on the left here, this is actually John Bingaman just going out on one of his dives back in the day. And so the first excavations on the Invincible wreck began in 1979, and they were undertaken for all of the decades from 1980s, ending in around 1990. And so in this time, John Bingaman was the UK government-appointed licensee of wreck and the archaeological director for the Invincible project.
So Brent, I want to
Yes.
keep an eye on the time, and we might have to pick up the pace a little bit.
Okay.
And then the next couple question breaks, I think we may give you a chance to take a breath, a drink, and then skip over so we can get as much of your content in as possible, because we do have another talk starting on
You bet.
this one. So thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so during the early days of the excavation, they found a number of interesting artifacts on the site, even some hemp rope coils protruding from the seabed. One of the interesting artifacts they found was a piece of leather, and their investigations determined that this was actually a cartridge case cover. And this illustration here would be a private in the 55th Regiment of Foot back in 1758. One of the key clues to this was the royal cipher that you see here. And this is associated with King George II. And he reigned between 1727 and 1760. And so this gave the team the origins of the ship and a time period. So as I said, excavation programs, the first range, which I've talked about, and then more recently, beginning in 2016, with Daniel Pascoe, who is the current government-appointed licensee of wreck. I'd like to shift gears and talk about artifact characterization. There's 4 broad categories here. There have been thousands of artifacts brought up from the Invincible wreck, and these include the ship's structure, equipment and stores, ordnance, and shipboard life. I'd like to just talk about the ship structure. None of it, or essentially all of it, has not been raised. It remains underwater. And this picture taken 2 years ago shows the Invincible wreck in situ. Now, ships of the day were built of giant wood timbers here, so you can see these frames, as we call them, that made up the shape of the hull. And today, underwater, some of the portion of the hull that survives, you can see here. These are the frames of the ship. And beneath, you can see some of the interior planking of the ship's hold. Here's an example of an artifact that's been recovered. It's just a small piece of timber from the ship, believed to be a cleat or a support that had been fastened to the side of the inside of the hull at some point. Of course, we don't know exactly where it came from on the wreck at this time. One of the more interesting things that was taken up from the ship's structure is the remains of the ship's grand magazine, where gunpowder was stored. And you can see here, they took it apart on the seabed and reconstructed it back on land. These vertical posts here were supports for racks. And these racks were used to store gunpowder cartridges. And this would have been associated with the filling room here on this illustration. The magazine was far below the waterline on the ship to protect it from enemy fire. So the grand magazine served two purposes. It was used for preparation of gun cartridges. So barrels we brought in, emptied in this wooden tub here, and they'd be portioned and filled into cartridge bags. And then the bags would go into these racks, as you see here in these two pictures. Moving on, talk about equipment and stores. Three categories, including rigging, navigation, and maintenance. And this picture here is on board HMS Victory and characterizes the carpenter's workroom. So one of the more fascinating artifacts come up in very large quantities off the wreck is hemp rope. This would be various diameters. And some of it has been tarred in antiquity. As you can see here in this picture, you can see kind of the remains of some tar. This helped to protect the integrity of the hemp on the seabed. Also, a large number of, a large number of rigging components have been found. This includes blocks such as this wooden truck, and also these three items here are called pulley pins. You can see just how badly grooved they are. They're extremely worn. So it tells us that these were actually used on board and were probably taken out of service just because they were so badly worn and damaged. And other rigging blocks, including this, what's called a bullseye kringle. This is about 9 inches overall in diameter, and you can see it here in conserved condition. Another fascinating wooden rigging block is this fiddle block. John Broomhead took this picture in 1980. He used his daughter, aged 4 at the time, just for scale, just to show how large some of these equipment pieces were. And the picture on the right just characterizes all the sorts of blocks that have been found on the wreck. I find this particular artifact quite fascinating. You may believe it to be a brush, maybe used for sweeping decks, and that would be a good guess. But this is actually a besom or breaming brush, and it's just made up of an assemblage of twigs. And the handles were stored separately. And about 90 of these were found on the wreck. And what they were used for is a process called breaming. So when ships spent months in the water, they would accumulate weeds and barnacles on the underside. And so periodically that would have to be removed. And so what would happen is these brushes would be assembled, they'd be dipped in tar, and they would be lit afire. And the men here would use that to burn the barnacles off the underside. Another interesting piece here, I believe it's elm, and as you can see here, it has some dovetail construction on either side. And some research has identified this to be likely a side panel from a compass box. And of course, compasses were used to steer and navigate the ship. And the compasses were held level at sea by this frame called a gimbal, which were on 2 axes. And you can see here the hole on the artifact here is most likely associated with the gimbal connection to the box. Just a beautiful, lovely piece. I love the wood grain that you see there. And another fascinating artifact from the wreck, a simple wood-staved bucket. And back at the time in antiquity, it would have been put together with iron banding. And today we can still see the remains of some iron oxide, rust that remains on the wood today. All right, I think for the interest of time, I'll just skip this question period and keep going. So everyone's favorite topic invariably is ordnance. I'd like to talk about guns and shot, gunpowder, small arms, and associated equipment. Now, if you were hoping to see pictures of cannon or guns recovered from the wreck, I'm going to disappoint you because, as I said, back in the time, all the cannon were taken off the wreck and taken over back to land on smaller boats, as is characterized here in this artwork by John Terry. Cannon shot or gunshots were stored in shot lockers in the lower portions of the hull. And this shot locker here is actually reconstructed on board HMS Victory. And the shot were simply put in the lockers and stored in there for battle. This is a composite picture of the lowermost hold of the wreck of the Invincible. The keel would be running lengthwise here underneath. And here you see this kind of lumpy pile here. So what happened is in antiquity, the shot lockers, which would have been here approximately, would have deteriorated and collapsed over time at the wreck. And when that happened, it scattered all the cannon shot at the bottom of the wreck. And over time, they concreted together just into this big lump of iron shot that you see here. I'd also like to talk about gunpowder barrels, which have been found on the wreck. They were kept in the annex or the palading flat, as it's called, in the Grand Magazine. And amazingly, complete gunpowder barrels, including the contents, were found on the wreck and have been recovered, excavated, and conserved. And here you see a picture from the early 80s of 2 of those barrels in situ on the wreck. All right, I'm sure many of you will like this slide here. So thousands of pieces of lead shot have been found on the wreck. There are 3 different calibers here for pistol shot. Middle is carbine, and then the largest are musket shot associated with our friend here and his musket rifle. There would have been 2 uses, both sea service for engagements on deck and also for military operations on land. And accompanying lead shot, numerous gun flints have been found, both for small arms and larger pieces for cannon flintlock mechanisms. Picture on the left you see here now is on board HMS Victory, and it just shows you an overview of implements used for the great guns or cannon. And this includes the gun rammers that were used to push the charge and the cannon shot down the barrel. And there are two types here, one on a fixed staff and another rammer on a flexible rope. And to the right here, we see an artifact from the Invincible wreck. This is one of those gun rammer heads. And we actually know it's for a 24-pound gun because if you look closely here, you can see that in antiquity, it's been stamped with the number 24 or 24 to identify the caliber of the equipment. Another interesting artifact, leather fire buckets. Many have been recovered from the wreck. This one has been conserved. Despite that, the top banding and the handle are missing, and it's been restitched in modern times. In contrast, other fire buckets found on the wreck, these are two that are not conserved and in seabed condition. They look quite different. So the stitching has let go. The bottom has fallen out, as you see here. And interesting characterization is the red paint, which is original. And this associates them as fire buckets because they were part of the gunner's equipment found on the gunner's storeroom on board the shipwreck. And so it would have been used for firefighting as shot came in and created small fires and whatnot on board. Now, just to move on to shipboard life, I'd like to talk about victualling, which involves food and personal clothing and personal effects. So a number of artifacts associated with food provisions and eating on board. Obviously, we have a wine or spirit bottle here. To the left here is a sailor's beer tankard. It's a wood-staved tankard. Also some utensils for eating, spoons, forks, knives made of wood and metal have been found on the wreck. And this eating plate here was used to standardize portions of food given out to the crew. This was important for just ensuring that they had a proper amount of controlled provisions on board for a number of months at sea. And actually, this plate here gives rise to the modern term 3 square meals a day because of the shape of the plate. So another thing that's been found in some quantities on the wreck site is articles of clothing. What you see here on the left is believed to be a hat belonging to regimental troops. We go back to our friend here on the 55th Regiment. He is wearing a very similar headdress. And in the 1980s, more than 200 pairs of shoes were found on the wreck. These would have been belonging to the crew. In varying conditions, from excellent, as you see here, to just pieces from deteriorated artifacts, such as a sole and a shoe buckle, as illustrated in this slide. This here, I have seen this artifact from the shipwreck in person. I put my iPhone 5 or 6 at the time below it for scale. So as you can see, this is a very small shoe, about 6 inches in length. And this gives, this lends to the fact that it was probably a children's shoe. So the first question is, what the heck were children doing on board a warship in 1758? So actually, in this day, at these times in history, this is very common for boys to go into the naval service, and they had 2 career paths. One for the more common reason, they would serve as powder monkeys. So they would be in charge or responsible for transporting the gun cartridges from the magazine up to the decks in battle. And they had the obvious advantage of being small, fast, and agile. And unfortunately, they were also expendable. Also at this time in history, there was another career path for boys, and this was as officer proteges. So this could be a captain's son or another senior officer's son being groomed for a future career as an officer in the Royal Navy. So just imagine today sending your 10-year-old son out to join the Navy. Likely he wouldn't come back because the death rates were quite high. Today it's just something that's completely unthinkable. And yet today, back in the day, it was just normal practice. All right, switching gears. This is a tiny padlock that was found on the wreck. It's about 1 inch in diameter. And you'd be wondering what this could possibly be used for. And some of you may think of your travel luggage, which comes with those hokey little padlocks. That's exactly what this is. So back in the day, gentlemen's luggage, they used portmanteaus, as you illustrate, as you see here. And they were leather travel cases, and they had flaps that could be secured and locked with these hoops with a chain going through, and then, of course, the padlock on the end. So this gives some indication that the artifact in question likely belonged to an officer on board the Invincible. This particular artifact here is the lid of a beer tankard, and he's carved his initials in antiquity just to identify his own property on board the ship. The last two artifacts I have here for you, the item on the left is a knit comb. So back at this time in history, head lice were very prevalent. I think probably almost everyone had them. And the only way to get rid of them would be to use a knit comb and pick them out. And so you see here the remains of one of these knit combs. And the item on the right is the partial remains of a syringe. And this would have belonged to the ship's surgeon and would have been used for the administration of mercury. At the time, mercury was used to treat venereal disease, including syphilis. And I will just leave it up to your imagination what that treatment looked like for sailors on board the ship of the time. All right, so Tom, we could break here for questions, or I can continue on.
Carry on. I think you've got just a couple left, and then we'll fit some questions in at the very end. So
sounds good. So in 2014, I learned of an opportunity to dive on the Invincible wreck. The only problem was I didn't know how to scuba dive. So I spent the next 2 summers, 2014 and 15, learning how to scuba dive in West Hawk Lake here in Manitoba. And so I gained my PADI open water, advanced open water, and dry suit certifications. And I prepared for the following year to dive on the wreck. This was a very special opportunity because it was a planned reunion with the original project team of Arthur Mack, John Broomhead, and John Bingaman to dive on the wreck on the 1st of May. So that was a 35-minute dive. What I did is I took video underwater of my dive, and I've condensed it into a 3-minute video just for display purposes here today. Unfortunately, I had some technical issues this morning, and so I think the presentation of the video clip will be quite choppy, unfortunately, but let's go ahead and do that anyway. So it was a nice, calm, sunny day for diving. Dan Pascoe, you should see it left there and now in the foreground. He is the government-appointed licensee today, and he went down first on the wreck just to investigate the conditions. And the other divers that day that joined me were John Bingaman. John Bingaman at the time in 2016 was 82 years old. So I admire him then and today for diving on the wreck with us. And also John Broomhead, my friend, you can see him hopefully getting ready to enter the water. And he's helped out by Arthur Mack in the checkered shirt. And of course, Arthur is the fellow who originally found the wreck of the Invincible. And so I was last off our dive boat here, jumped into the water. I got my nerves together, checked over my equipment, and I made my way up along the swim line on the side of our boat. And it's an easy venture down because I just followed the anchor cable for the boat down to the seabed, which is 25 feet below. And a lot of particulate in the solent, so the visibility, actually it was good on that day. It was about 10 to 12 feet. So the first things you see here, hopefully, John Broomhead in front of me, just looking back, making sure I'm behind him. And you can see John Bingaman on the surface. Now we start seeing the wreck of the Invincible here, the ship's frames, the giant timbers that made up the shape of the hull, and the very lowest part of the hold and associated structures. Here you can see, hopefully, some of the ship's planking and how it was attached to the frames. And this was our last sight of the vessel here, a starboard section of the wreck that had broken off in antiquity and is now elsewhere on the seabed. Now going back up to surface and the safety of our dive boat. So I'm sorry that I know that's a very short video clip. I hope it gives you some sense of what my dive was like. And of course, I do have to apologize for the technical issue. The video was probably a bit choppy for you. So let's just have a look at the dive site characterization here. The wreck of the Invincible today, there is one large section of the hull of the port side. It's the lower side of the hull. And we came down about the center of that part. We advanced forward to the bow. Then we went across some disarticulated timbers from the wreck, and we zigzagged and we went over to that last section, which is a piece of the starboard lower hull side, and it's been disarticulated from the rest of the wreck site. Okay, I think we could open up to questions here, Tom, if that's a good time.
Yeah, this has been great, Brent. Thank you. And I wanted to say I was watching the video on YouTube rather than watching it on the stream here, and it was a little bit choppy, but it was still fantastic to see and get that experience. So I really personally don't think it detracted that much. So thank you for sharing that with us. There is a little bit of a delay, so I'll try to keep monitoring the questions, but a couple quick ones. So this one came up some time ago while you were before you were talking about the wreck, and somebody was asking what would be a serviceable life for a wooden ship in that era. So how long, if the Admiralty is building a new ship, how long could they reasonably expect to get out of a ship, assuming it was a fairly lucky ship and it didn't sink right off the docks?
Okay, great question. So if a ship was built well, it was not hurried into service, so the frames were allowed to season properly. A ship could last and have lasted well over 100 years in service, as opposed to other ships built during times of war. They were built with green timber that hadn't been seasoned properly. They were literally rotting when they were launched, and some ships lasted only 10 years. So it really their lifespan varied greatly, but it wasn't uncommon to see ships in service after 100 years.
Thank you. And somewhat related to that, there's a note.
Really looked at the circumstances of how the British navies and the French navies designed and built ships. So the British used what's called the establishment or established practice. And this was really designed by trial and error to some extent. Whereas their counterparts, the French, they were very well entrenched in science and engineering in terms of the design of their ships. So this has been actually quite well documented and is directly attributable to why the Invincible and her sister ships were effectively better sailors compared to the British warships, which had some just very generally characterized as stability issues and some issues with sailing quality, just because of the shapes of hulls, where masts were placed, and how the ships were trimmed in the water. So yes, it's actually an established difference.
Thank you. So a few questions about the wreck now, and some of the things you were able to explore. So a couple related to the woodwork. Somebody said that it looked very well preserved, and they asked, what would the water temperature be like in that area?
Okay, so the water temperature varies. Not being a resident, I'm not well versed, but in the summertime, I think the water temperature gets up to about 8, maybe 10 degrees, so Celsius. The water temperature doesn't come into play in terms of the survival integrity of the wreck. And what happened is that the remains of the wreck, portions of, became buried under the surface of the sand, and the conditions locally there are anaerobic, meaning an absence of oxygen. And that is the critical factor for the lack of deterioration. Once timbers and artifacts are exposed to the water without that layer of protection, they degrade very quickly. So literally, I've seen pictures of timbers that look like they were cut and put on the ship yesterday because they're so pristine. And while others that have been exposed for months or years are badly deteriorated.
So related to that, maybe you could just wait a quick question about the figurehead or some of that beautiful scroll work on the stern that you were talking about. Did any of that survive?
My understanding is that today and previous, none has been identified. Some of it may have been removed, likely not. We're not too sure what happened with the figurehead, although it could have been cut off or removed at the time of the dismantling in 1758. However, the cutwater, which is a structure that connected the figurehead to the front of the ship, a massive timber structure, was recently recovered. It was found and salvaged and is currently under conservation. This thing is an absolutely massive sized timber. In terms of the scroll work ornamentation in the stern of the ship, in the stern galleries, I don't believe that any has been found. I'm not sure about survival from back in the day. Maybe there's some that's still buried. It's possible, but none has been found to date.
So it is possible that some of the wreckage is still buried in the sand.
It would be a question for the licensee of wreck today, Dan Pascoe. I would just on a hedging bet say it's possible. Yes, might be unlikely. I personally would love to see future excavations recover, because I think it would be amazing to see some of that ornamentation today.
Great, thank you. And Tom said that have you got a couple slides about books that you wanted to share as well?
I sure do. Myself and my friend John Broomhead, who was part of the original team, we co-wrote a book on the story, a biography of Arthur Mack. And as you see here, he's led a very fascinating life from very humble and hard beginnings on to being a very, very lucky man in having made a number of archaeological finds in his lifetime. So paperback is available in the UK only. And for the rest of the world, you can purchase an ebook copy, and it is sold exclusively on Amazon.com. Now, for those who are interested in what you've seen today in the history of the ship and the ship's artifacts, you can buy this book by first licensee John M. Bingaman. First edition, it can be found on the internet. And the second edition, which is newer and enhanced, is sold exclusively by John Bingaman, and you can contact John directly in the email account, email address listed on this slide, and he will provide you with a shipping quote around the world. I'd like to acknowledge also a museum exhibition that is ongoing, Diving Deep, HMS Invincible, 1744. This is ongoing in the UK. Right now it's at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard through October, and then it's taken down, relocated, and reopened at the Historic Dockyard at Chatham, also in the UK, just east of London, and it opens April 2022. I'm really hopeful that we can all get through this pandemic, and some of us are lucky enough to travel and see this museum exhibition, because I know that there's many fascinating things to see. And finally, I'd encourage you, if you'd like to learn more, go to this project website, hmsinvincible1744.org.uk. And this is an amazing site that's been prepared by the exhibition team. It covers the history of the ship, the archaeological work that's been undertaken in the past few years, the artifacts, but it also touches on the history of the ship and looks at the crew and some of the artifacts that have been recovered. And I would like to close today just by acknowledging the partners in the exhibition project, that being the Historic Dockyard Chatham in the UK, also Bournemouth University, the Maritime Archaeology Sea Trust, the UK Lottery Heritage Fund, and of course, the National Museum of the Royal Navy. And so that does conclude my slide presentation, and I will pass it back off to Tom.
Brent, thanks so much. Fascinating. I like the history of the ship. Not sure I like its unfortunate demise and sinking under the waters, but then its discovery and then this look at items recovered from it. It was all quite amazing, and seeing lots of good feedback, and people made comments. They thought the video come across fairly well, and it gave them a good sense of what it would be like to dive on the Invincible. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Brent, for an outstanding presentation.